Let's finish off this section B with the 15-mark question. So, discuss the likely benefits of increased economic integration for the sub-Saharan African countries. So let's take a minute and let's actually think what this is asking us very simply. So of course, as we know in this extract, they are essentially all becoming more integrated. They are joining a trading bloc. So what do we call it when countries join a trading bloc? This part of your spec, we of course call this trade creation. Since trade is being created, because when you join a trading bloc, what do countries normally do? As it says here, they remove tariffs, and they said in this scenario for the AFCFTA, they're removing tariffs on over 90% of the goods and liberalizing services. Therefore, essentially, they're removing trade barriers. And of course, if you remove trade barriers, which of course we can show on a trade barrier diagram, so supply, demand, of course, supply is domestic, demand is domestic, then here would be world supply plus tariff, and this would be world supply. Now, of course, we think about it in the backwards way now. So if we're going from our original equilibrium is world supply plus tariff towards, so we're shifting it down now. So we're shifting from world supply plus tariff to now world supply. Let's see how that is going to affect. So Q1, Q2, Q3. We're going to go from the quantity imported being this much, this small arrow here. So this used to be quantity imported. Now quantity imported will grow to from Q3, Q4 to now Q1, Q2. What does this mean? The quantity imported has grown in an economy. What does that mean? It means, of course, there's more trade, and more trade, of course, is what we call trade creation and economic integration. So that's a really good diagram, 100% we will be using to answer this question. So like I said, let's get started with that first paragraph, and like I said, it is of course going to be on trade creation. So one benefit of increased economic integration for the sub-Saharan countries would of course be trade creation, and I'm just going to quote the extract directly where it talked about 90% of goods and services and goods and then liberalizing services. So to present our point which trade creation is a benefit, bit of application, let's now move on to the chain of analysis. So trade barriers, E.G, tariffs, what do? They distort the theory of comparative advantage. You should know the theory of comparative advantage, covered on the Econ website. But yeah, they distort the theory of comparative advantage and globalization. As originally, the increased integration between global economies meant that countries were able to specialize in the goods and services they had a comparative advantage in. For example, we know Nigeria has a comparative advantage in oil, just like we would say Saudi Arabia has a comparative advantage in oil. But with countries setting trade barriers like tariffs, it meant that economies were not able to fully specialize in the goods they had a comparative advantage in and had to remain diversified and have to have a slightly diversified portfolio, as things like quotas, tariffs were in place, so they couldn't always import the goods they needed. But now, with these economies dedicating the African CFTA, it means these countries can finally dedicate more factors to production and really exploit their comparative advantage. As for example, before Nigeria could have had maybe 10% of their workers in the food industry and 90% in the oil industry, as they were scared if countries set a quota, like stop trading food with them, they would have no way to get food into the economy, therefore they had to remain diversified. But now, due to this joining this trading bloc and then no longer being trading barriers, it means Nigeria can become even more efficient. That 10%, they can now dedicate even more of those individuals to the industry they have a comparative advantage in, which of course is oil. Therefore, of course, that will compound the positive effects. And of course, adding the real world application, so trading bloc, of course, includes 1.2 billion people. It's going to has a combined GDP of almost over 2 trillion. And of course, make sure to show this trade creation on the diagram where when we remove trade barriers such as tariffs, it shifts world supply plus T to world supply, thus meaning the quantity imported changes from a small number, which is Q2 to Q3, to now the much bigger arrow of Q1, Q4, which of course would be this arrow here. But now overall, how would you link this all back together? How does it actually benefit the economy? There's several different ways you can go about it, but since economies can dedicate more factors of production to the sectors that they have a comparative advantage in, of course they can produce more output, and of course if they produce more output, if you think about what is the meaning of GDP, the total goods and services produced in the economy, it means of an increased GDP, so positive economic growth. But then what is the overall aim? This is what globalization, I think the development topic really teaches at A level, especially, and a lot of A level students forget this. What is the reason of these macro objectives of things like increased GDP and increased economic growth? Is that the main aim isn't just getting higher and higher GDP. The main aim is, of course, the living standards. The government wants GDP to improve. Why? Because they think it's an indicator it shows how living standards are. So at the end of the day, by countries increasing the economic integration by removing the trade barriers. It will therefore, at the last stage of things, hopefully allow for improved living standards. Okay, so I've just written up a bit of that chain of analysis. It's not everything there, but it does cover the main points. But that is how I would tackle that first paragraph for this question. Let's now move on to the evaluation points. Also, I maybe didn't mention this at the start of the question, but for this question, if you're struggling to think of points, benefits of increased economic integration, I think a really easy way to think about this is just think about the different shareholders. So the benefits to, like I always say, consumers, producers, employees, so like producers being firms, and the government, and that really gives you a lot of ideas here of how to navigate this. So with regards to evaluation, sometimes you need to think about it in the terms of some points have really good evaluation points. Like always, if you're talking about a like random micro example, a negative externality with tax, a really good evaluation, a standard one you should be using every time, depends on the size of the tax. Or for example, depends on the elasticity of the tax. Or with like something like expansion monetary policy, it boosting the economy, you could talk about the level of consumer confidence, as of course, even if interest rates are really low, if the level of consumer confidence is also low, it will not have a substantial benefit, it will not boost AD substantially. And with regards to trading blocks and trade creation, a really good evaluation point is always trade diversion, and it's just a standard one that it just should be like almost memorized, just revised by you to know, okay, if I'm ever talking about trade creation or trading blocks, a really good evaluation point is always trade diversion. So a really good evaluation point with regards to any sort of trading block leading to trade creation in this scenario is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of trade diversion. Since, as we know in a trading block, it increases trade within the member countries. So in this example, the intra-Africa trade increases massively. Why? Since they remove trade barriers. But they remove trade barriers for each other and usually set trade barriers on countries outside the trading bloc. Therefore, what does this mean? It means that before Nigeria, for example, joined this African CFTA, it could have meant they were importing goods from, for example, a relatively low-cost producer like China. But now, since they've joined the trading bloc, this trading bloc now has tariffs on China. Therefore, now China has become more expensive. This will therefore mean they will now import from a producer within Africa, but relatively, that producer in Africa will be more expensive, thus it is inefficient. So it's a bit of a tricky concept. I just want to make sure you understand that. So when China produce that good, they produce it for cheaper. They can produce it at a lower cost. But now, due to Nigeria joining this trading bloc, there is now a tariff on China, meaning that is actually more expensive for Nigeria to import from China. Therefore, they will substitute to now an African country who produces the same goods. But this African country is actually less efficient than China, but as it's tariff-free, it works out cheaper. But this is why we can say trading blocks, it depends on the degree of trade diversion, as it could actually lead to less efficient outcomes for the global economy. Thus, of course, you could actually link that to, thus meaning to worsen living standards for the global economy. So a bit of an in-depth evaluation point, but definitely an absolute A-star evaluation point if you can execute it correctly. Another great evaluation point is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the distribution of benefits. As essentially the main point here is that it's going to disproportionately, this trading bloc of the African CFTA, it's going to disproportionately benefit the larger economies such as Nigeria and South Africa, for example. But the smaller economies like Malawi, for example, a landlocked country which has quite weak infrastructure, not much manufacturing sector, they're not going to benefit much from this trading bloc. Why? Since they literally don't produce a lot to export a lot. Therefore, like we said, they won't benefit nowhere near as much as these larger economies who have massive exporting sectors, have great infrastructure. Therefore, it depends on the degree to the distribution of the positive effects. So, like I said, it's going to be very concentrated around the larger economies, and the smaller economies, things like living standards, won't improve anywhere near as much as the larger economy. So that's more than enough detail for the first paragraph. I'll just briefly go through what I'd write for the second paragraph. I would focus this paragraph on firms, and specifically how the increased economic integration allows firms to exploit their economies of scale. Now, a massive misconception students have is because it's macro, they won't draw this diagram. 100%, it's a great diagram to draw, of course, to show your economy of scale, show your economies, then your diseconomies, then just link it to the definition. What is the definition of economies of scale? As output increases, what happens to longer average cost? Of course, longer average cost fall. But yeah, essentially the main point in this paragraph, firms exploit their economy of scale. Why? Since now with no trade barriers or reduced trade barriers, it will therefore mean firms can now access larger markets. They can sell to larger markets. For example, instead of just selling domestically, they can sell to the whole of Africa now. And of course, link it to the definition. as their output increases, their costs will fall. So now, of course, if firms' costs are falling, and yes, they're selling to larger markets, they're selling to more individuals, of course, you can comment on the firm's profits. Firms will be making more profits. There's many different shareholders that will affect, like employees, like the government, for example. Government's tax revenue will be increased. The corporation tax specifically will increase. Things like consumers receiving lower prices. It leads to better things like consumer welfare. And also, if firms are producing more output, it will lead to more choice for consumers, which of course is a massive positive. And then with firms doing better, like I said, more derived demand for labour, therefore more employment within these economies. If there's more employment, and again, all these things like increased corporation tax for the government, increased choice for consumers, and all these things like increased corporation tax for the government, increased employment, what will they lead to in the end? It will of course lead to more like things like GDP, and at the end of the day will lead to increased living standards. As of course, if more people have jobs, it means have more incomes, they can demand goods and services they want and need, therefore of course improving their living standards. Now, quickly and briefly going through the evaluation points. A great evaluation point with regards to, so we're saying one of the big benefits is that they will gain increased corporation tax revenue, but of course by removing trade barriers, what do they lose out on? Of course they massively lose out on tariffs, so the tax revenue gained from tariffs, so especially the less developed economies, like I said, the economies like Malawi, who probably won't see a massive increase in the amount of output produced, since they have very weak infrastructure, very weak sectors. They won't see much increase in corporation tax revenue, but they're going to see a massive decrease in the amount of tariff revenue they're going to gain. So it could actually depend on the, you essentially want to weigh up the positives versus negatives of getting rid of the tariff, whether it's better for them to maintain the tariff, or it's better for them to try to grow their economy and gain that tax revenue via corporation tax. Then of course you have concepts like transfer pricing, which could reduce the degree of tax revenue. Even things that the context had already mentioned, where of course our last question was on with, we talk about firms' costs decreasing, but will they be able to compete with the other African economies and their lower costs, so therefore they could actually go out of business instead? Then even including a bit of the context where, if you remember back to the last question, what I mentioned with lower labour costs, so will these firms, yes, have access to larger markets, but will they now, even if they are experiencing economies of scale, will they be able to compete with these other firms, these other African firms, lower labour costs? So that's a great question you can ask in evaluation and pick up quite a few marks. But yeah, that is a wrap on this 2020 Paper 2 Section B. I hope that helped. And now let's move on to the 25 mark questions for Section C.